Hello, my name is Dr. Thomas Knestrictt, and I am a professor at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, United States of America. And today I'm going to be talking about my paper that is called "What is Different About Special Education?" In our current environment in the United States, we have separate tracks, much like other countries. We have the general education track and we have special education track, and we have gifted education, so forth. I spent my PhD is in special education. I taught special education in the public schools, and now I research special education. And I was also a student in special education years and years ago. And I got to tell you that I'm not a big supporter of special education as it's here currently in the United States. There's a huge movement towards dual licensure for every teacher. I'm solidly against that as well. And this paper is just a continued investigation of why that may not be a good idea, and why teaching children from a different perspective than special education has is probably a better idea for everyone involved. So I'm going to share my screen. You'll luckily not be looking at me the whole time, and we'll get underway. So I originally began this way of thinking about special education and education in general several years ago. And one of the things that became very obvious to me is there's a different vibe, there's a different kind of thrust, theoretical thrust in special education as compared to teaching, in quote, typical children in the classroom. And I started to investigate that. I've also done some writing on what I call the special education industrial complex, because there's a huge amount of money involved in all of this. And I think it impacts how we understand special education, and how we understand and actually deal with folks who have learning differences. And I much prefer that term, learning differences, as opposed to classifying it as a disability. So that's where we're going to start. We're moving towards a more heuristic model of teaching and learning, and that's an integral part of the paper. So let me read the abstract to you, and we can jump off from there. In the United States, we've been moving towards a more inclusive structure and model of service for all students. However, it is still viewed and constructed through a perspective of separating out students who are typical and students identified as special needs, in quotation marks, because of the influence of federal dollars that prop up special education and the special education industrial complex. We still maintain separate tracks of students, and assessing any support services still hinges upon identification and placement of students. These perceived differences are also created because of a fundamental difference in philosophical way we view learning in the United States. The U.S. education structure utilizes what I call an algorithmic standards-based approach, based only on empirical test data, rather than a more heuristic model that emphasizes the process of learning and the development of intellectual autonomy. Inclusive educational models, while including identified students in the general classroom to a higher degree, still require identification and placement through a federally funded special education process, and still emphasizes learning through an algorithmic, product-oriented, standards-based approach. Inclusive models, or even dual licensure teacher education programs, will not change these realities until a more heuristic approach is used for all students. Not operationalizing this new way of thinking leads to what I call the special edification of teaching and learning. So there's a couple of things I want to point out in this general overview. The first is this idea of algorithmic and heuristic, right? So those are main tenets in my way of thinking about things. The other one is this special edification. term that I made up. You know, all good critical theorists make up their own words. So I made up that word. And it's the idea that we're moving towards teaching in this individualized, algorithmic way, as opposed to looking at kids and where they're starting, what they need in order to engage and to learn and own the information. And there's byproducts of this way of teaching. And that's, again, something that we'll go through pretty thoroughly in this paper. So there's some basic themes. Algorithmic learning. So algorithmic learning is learning that's mapped out, and the learner learns the steps to one conclusion. This approach emphasizes product and limits creativity and deeper learning that connects to prior learning. So really what we have here is a conflict between a constructivist way of thinking about teaching and learning and a non-constructivist or a more linear algorithmic way of teaching and learning. And I'm here to advocate for the heuristic way and the more holistic way because of several reasons, which I'll draw out in the paper. Heuristic learning is learning that emphasizes the process of learning and the construction of understanding. It's correlated with creativity, collaboration, engagement, and a deeper understanding because it is linked to prior learning. That's something that Constance Camille, one of my favorite researchers, draws out in her research as well. So it's a conflict between these two ways of thinking about how people learn and how we should teach. Special education is entrenched in this linear, standards-based, behavioral way of looking at teaching and learning. And what we get with that can be measured by, you get a defined and very empirical outcome that can be measured. So in terms of special education, you'll have an objective and you'll work towards this student learning this objective, and then you'll give them an assessment that will prove or disprove that they've learned that objective. And that's it, right? Heuristic outcomes result in the student not just getting the correct answer, but also being able to defend and explain their thinking on solving the equation. This type of student response reflects a depth of understanding, connection to prior learning, and intellectual autonomy. So that the term intellectual autonomy is this idea that kids learn something so deeply that they can defend their answer, they can explain their thinking as how they got that answer, and they connect it to prior learning. They can, in other words, say, well, this objective about water cycle, right, and understanding the water cycle is connected to all the learning I've done previously about water and about evaporation and all those other concepts that go into that. So it's not only learning that objective, it's also connecting to the prior learning, and that will give you a greater depth of understanding. So Giroux had a similar concept that he talked about. In 2018, he spoke about what he called the technocratic approach or the management approach to teaching and learning. His analysis dealt mainly with the wholesale standardization of curriculum and the de-intellectualization of the teaching profession. And I think that is the special education of education in the United States. Everybody's moving towards that. So here's the main point of the paper. It can be said that there is no better example of the technocratic or teaching style that Giroux talked about in educational pedagogy than special ed. It's based upon many of the tenets Giroux describes and does not encourage reflective teaching practice or reflective learners. What differentiates special ed pedagogy from a more responsive heuristic pedagogy that develops critical thinkers and fosters intellectual curiosity is that it is algorithmic, it's linear and technocratic, and it's a solid example of the management pedagogical theory and practice. Objective, instruction, assessment. No consideration or discussion of how this learning is connected to prior learning in all other areas. So this assimilation and accommodation idea that Piaget had is not addressed in linear learning, in algorithmic learning. It doesn't measure, and because it's not measured, it's not concerned with connecting to others. We're like, well, they'll do that themselves. And what I find in my research is that engaging heuristic learning creates this whole to part learning. Behaviorist or behavioral learning objectives are just concerned about the parts first. So we're going to get to the granular first, whereas a heuristic is more holistic. You're going to look at the big picture of things and be able to fit your current learning into this bigger picture. That creates intellectual autonomy. Students will be very confident about what they know and how it connects to everything else. Another main point: forcing teaching and learning into strict scientific perspective, like the behavioral standardized approach, creates a very linear, standards-based curriculum. The development of special education practice was heavily influenced by this way of thinking. This, along with the dramatic influence of the medical model on special education practice, created this illusion that there is some specialized knowledge base in special education that is radically different than general education. So what I'm always saying is, good teaching is good teaching is good teaching. It doesn't depend upon the learner, it depends upon the teacher, right? Good teaching trumps everything else. If they're engaging students and kids are interested and engaged, they learn it, and they will learn to connect it to this greater, that will learn to assimilate and accommodate it into this greater holistic picture of information that they're taking in. It's quite simple when you think about it that way. That teaching is much harder. It's much more time investment, and it's much more, it takes a lot more teacher effort, because not all kids are engaged, and you have to figure out what channel to dial in for this specific kid in order to get him engaged in it, and that's the art of teaching, right? So you've heard this discussion of science. Is teaching science or art? Well, it's both. Pedagogy is a quasi science, but yet you still have to dial in the specific channel that student needs to learn the concepts and to learn the process. Here are the specific differences that I came up with when you look at special education practice and classroom and teaching in a typical ed classroom. The first is the individualized education plan, the IEP. It's a very linear behavioral document. It states an academic objective. It states how you're going to meet that objective and how you are going to measure that objective. And the way special education works is you have checklists, basically, and you have this running record on your IEP goals. When you're done, you check it off, you move to the next one. There is no heuristic way of looking at it. There's no holistic learning. They don't measure whether this kid connected this learning to other things. There's no way to measure how confident he is. It's the test. It's the assessment you use that measures that, and it's either going to measure it or not. And if you measure it, you're done. You go to the next one. If you didn't master it according to the assessment, you reteach. So to me, there's a couple things about that that's problematic. The first is, you're not even concerned about connections to prior learning. You're concerned about meeting this objective and meeting the goals on the IEP. The other thing is that to me, what I've seen in practice is it creates a very uncreative teaching style. You become very kind of rote in your teaching and learning. You do the same thing in the same way. And, Piaget talked a lot about unit understanding, right? So you're teaching, let's, for example, use multiplication facts. You're teaching multiplication facts, right? So a behavioral way of looking at that, an IEP goal would say, we'll master his 1 through 9 multiplication facts with 100% accuracy, right? So all he is concerned about is whether or not they know the answers to the multiplication facts 1 to 9. They're not concerned about whether they understand that multiplication is related to addition, that multiplication is also related to division, that multiplication facts are going to be something that you want to master and put into long-term memory to make later math, or later math you're going to learn at some point in time later easier, because you no longer have to figure out on your fingers these multiplication facts. You've got it down and you can learn these higher level algebra or calculus processes. None of that matters. They just want you to master those facts. The other concept was specially designed instruction. I found that it's not always special, and it's not always qualitatively different than anything else. So I'm not sure I understand what specially designed instruction. So, we're from special ed, so we have it is acronym hell. So they just call it SDI. What's your SDI? Your IEP needs to reflect SDI. It's not specially designed because it's always going to be behavioral. It's always going to be linear. It's always going to be algorithmic. You have an objective, you get the answers. So I'm not always sure what SDI means. And besides, we'll specially design instruction for the typical kid too. Well, what channel do we have to dial in? This kid needs this, and this kid needs this. So we do the same thing. We just don't call it SDI. Modified or accommodated strategies. This is another one that tends to be, in my mind, problematic. So if you have an objective and you want to modify or accommodate that, you change the assignment, right? Or you change the objective. It's related to another one down here that we're going to call direct instruction. But the idea is that you're going to change the outcome and the process by which you're teaching these things for kids. Again, the goal being mastering this objective, not connecting it to prior learning. Location of services. So in special education, you have the least restrictive environment, which means how much time can we maximize this child's time with his typically developing peers, and at the same time meet his academic needs. This is a financial decision many times. And here recently in the past 20 years, it's been that we don't have as many different locations for the kids to be. Most kids are integrated into the regular classroom in some way, and I'm all for that. I just don't think we need to label them to get them to into the location that they need to be in. And the last one is direct instruction, and that's the breaking down of objectives into parts. I'm in the state of Ohio in the United States, and we have what's called the extended learning standard. So we have the regular learning standard. Let's say it's a reading objective. And for kids, quote, in special ed, or kids who need specialized instruction, they break that objective down into its task analyzed parts so that you can still be working on this objective and working on these sub objectives towards the larger objective. Again, it's still linear. It's still concerned about that objective, and it's not as concerned about connecting to prior learning and assimilating and accommodating new information. Those are the differences. And I would put towards you that any of these can be achieved without identifying a kid in special ed. Now, I keep using that word identified. So we have this process, you're identified with a disability. So let's give you a little personal information here. I was a kid who was identified with a specific learning disability related to language and reading. And I'm 63 years old now, and I still think of myself as the kid with a learning disability. I am not confident many times in teaching and specifically expressing what I know. And I work in a place with a lot of really smart people, and I tend to keep my profile low because I'm not confident. And that's what happens when you identify kid with a special need. It's less than, you feel less than. So let's not do it anymore. Let's just meet the kids' needs where they're at. That's my pie in the sky that I want. So create a pedagogical environment suited for linear standards, based approach, based approach, and is behavioral in nature. It's easily measured and progress can be proven, right? So that's the special education of American education. We're in this linear niche right now. Objectives, teach, measure. Objective, teach, measure. It's scientific, it's linear, and it's not heuristic. We don't know if they're making these connections or not. Now, they may well be, but we're not actively trying to connect it in any way as part of our pedagogy. And to me, that's problematic. Let me give you a specific example. For example, if the specific target is stated to be students will demonstrate mastery of the multiplication facts to 9 with 100% accuracy when given a sheet of multiplication facts, it would be easy to measure the success at this completion of this assessment. However, it does nothing to show that he understands the connection between multiplication and addition, or that the reverse of multiplication is division, which is also related to subtraction, or that the student understands that 7 times 8 equals 56 means in a global sense, or that the student understands how to apply these skills to other types of problems. It measures only the product. General educators are not only concerned about the learning of multiplication facts, but all the assimilated and accommodated information that connects to them. Again, Constance Camille, one of my favorites. Here are some final thoughts. There is a separate training and licensure to teach special education. This creates a separate lane, the appearance of a separate body of pedagogical knowledge. It also introduces millions of dollars of federal money to the equation. This is the difference between general and special education. Teaching the whole child is a fundamental tenet of effective pedagogy. There are exceptional teachers, creative, talented, and excited about finding the channel that student requires to experience learning, and they do not wish to be limited to a behavioral or explicit instructional model. One more final thought. Special education curriculum and pedagogy can be provided without labeling, without measuring and comparing children to the norm. If we simply taught children the way they need to learn, provide support and personnel to support this teaching and learning, assess the children from where they started, not from where they should be, and focus on engagement and broad, deep learning, then special education and dual licensure or any segregating of students would not be needed. And again, I come from a pretty unique perspective, a kid who was in special ed, a man who taught special ed and now researches pedagogy in special ed and in general ed. And I found that these are problematic situations. The paper will be posted if you'd like to read it. I'd love for you to interact with it and to contact me if you care to. Oh, do I have another one? Or is that it? I think that's it. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you joining me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. My email will be on the paper, and good day.